I should be sharing my screen now. Can you see my screen?
Yep.
Perfect. Great. Well, thanks for the intro, Adam. It's nice. I kept it a bit cryptic to get you interested. I titled this talk actually "Open Standards and OKI" just to make it a little bit easier. The reason why I'm giving it this presentation and the reason why sort of this cryptic title came about was because of a workshop that I attended in April in Brussels, which was called Decision Making in Standard Developing Organizations for the Internet. There you go. Open standards are generally important to the open space, together with sort of open data, open source software. Open standards sort of help us ensure to reduce, I guess, dependency on proprietary suppliers. In the government context, it's often I have in a previous sort of role also pushed for open standards with governments in particular to reduce dependency on proprietary suppliers, make sure that the standards that they implement are open so other organizations can implement them as well. Of course, we develop standards ourselves in frictionless data, particularly around the data package and the related standards there. And collaborating in the standards body can help us raise awareness of our work considerably. And I know Paul's been, I don't know if Paul's on the call. He is on the call, right? So you can maybe expand a bit more later about this, but it can help us as a forum to not only sort of help mature the standards that we develop and get bigger uptake, etc. This workshop specifically was bringing together stakeholders in Europe around these standards bodies, in particular looking at open standards. So if you look at the landscape of standards bodies, the two main ones that are relevant from the perspective of open standards are W3C, World Wide Web Consortium, and IETF, who've been sort of almost exclusively sort of devoted, not almost exclusively devoted themselves to open standards, where there are other standards bodies like IEEE, who's been around for much longer, try to to keep an open image and have the possibility to develop open standards, but also sort of struggle sometimes with patent policies and sort of more proprietary organizations that are sort of active in their standards organization, not necessarily wanting to be fully open or wanting to negotiate, and what that means in practice is often they want to negotiate licenses for using the standards, basically using the standard as a way of making money. OASIS similarly is a standards body who'd like to be perceived as being open, and they were represented at this workshop as well. Often in practice, they have many standards which are operating under different licenses. So you have to pay in order to use the license to use and build on the standard. It was quite interesting to see at the workshop that there was a distinction between, on the one hand, the open standards bodies like W3C and IETF, and on the other hand, there was one guy from OASIS who worked at Oracle, which didn't help, trying to to put forward that OASIS was much more open than they've been in the past, and they have tried to become sort of more open and develop new processes for developing standards openly, but they weren't taken very seriously. And for the purpose of the rest of this presentation, I'll focus on the open standards bodies. So W3C and IETF in particular. So how it works, I won't bore you with the details, but in practice, if you look at sort of the two organizations, they operate in quite a similar fashion, in that there's a process for proposing a new standard, which which always goes through working groups. So there's a process for proposing a new working group, and what you need to do if you're new to this is you need to get sufficient sort of level of buy-in from other people who think it's a good idea to develop this new standard and set up a new working group to do this with. So all standards are being developed within the concept of a working group, which is a group of people collaborating on a mailing list, having meetings online or in person sometimes as well. And the working group is open. Anyone can join. Anyone can read. Anyone can contribute to these drafts. And together they draft these standards. Often there is prior work being done by one or two organizations. There are sometimes multiple people working on something similar that they try to harmonize into one standard through this. And all of those sort of mechanisms can happen with these standards, both in W3C and in IETF. And then there's a specific process to move drafts to a final agreed spec. There's often a process or a period of time where you can have like there's a final call, for example, there's a final sort of opportunity for people to provide feedback, and then after that, this spec is being seen as final. In IETF, those are called RFCs, and once an RFC in IETF, for example, is agreed and published, there's no change possible, and the working group would sort of dismantle, and any sort of further work or changes that need to happen would need to happen through a different working group, or you would need to set up a separate working group to develop a new standard. So yeah, that's sort of in a nutshell how these organizations work. I think it was one of the things that I picked up on, which I thought was quite interesting, is that often the process is that you don't seek explicit agreement from everyone on the group to finalize a spec or a standard, but what you do is you try and make sure that people don't have specific disagreements. So by having that focus, it's actually been in practice quite successful to move standards to the final stage, because people don't, people may not always agree with everything, but in particular in the IETF process, they are not asked to agree, but they only asked if they have, like no explicit disagreement with it. So it wouldn't come up to a vote to move an RFC to publication phase, but it's just if you don't have an explicit disagreement that you feel is important enough to raise, then we'll assume, lazy consensus, and we publish the standard. And I thought that was quite an interesting way of decision making, where you don't, sometimes you're not fully on board and you wouldn't vote in favor, but you're also not sufficiently against something that you want to raise your voice. In this process, those kinds of people would not be, blocking these kinds of processes, and that has helped, I think, IETF in particular to move relatively quickly in standards. Other thing I wanted to mention was OpenStand, which is a collaboration between the organizations you see here. IEEE, ISOC, IAB, which is the Internet Architecture Board, is actually part of IETF, but somehow they're listed separately. IETF and W3C formally drafted and jointly affirmed the principles of OpenStand in an effort to mobilize ongoing global support for the application of open but market-driven principles in standards and technology development. It's a bit blah blah, if you ask me, but it's relevant. I think it's so interesting because it's been trying to cement sort of what open standards are and what it isn't, and you can see the 5 core principles here that I wouldn't sort of all read out, but in particular, of course, availability of standard specification number 4 is an important one, which is often not really there for some other standards body. And then, there's this whole spiel about the market deciding what's best, and this sort of meritocratic principle behind it, which I think was quite interesting. Finally, there's 2 major developments that I wanted to highlight. One is, if you look at sort of the way standards move now compared to, let's say, 10 years ago, is that implementation of standards is moving a lot faster. For example, browsers pushing updates to everyone's desktops all the time means that there's a much more rapid implementation processes for standards. And standards often have been implemented across the board and is used by millions of people before the standard is actually finalized. which makes the process of finalizing these standards sometimes a little bit obsolete. So the process of formalizing standards in that case is not keeping up with the practice. Sometimes you see new type of approaches emerge. So there's the WG or WG, I'm not sure the different ways of pronouncing it, which is a group which actually already started in 2004, but sort of taking on development of HTML and DOM and some other standards outside of IETF to make sure that the speed within which these developments are taking place can actually better sort of keep up with daily practice. The other opportunity that you have there as this result is that sort of working software is playing a bigger role in defining the standard. So where in the old days you would sit together and think about what you need from a more information perspective, I guess, and then figure out the standard and then implement it. What you see now is that there's more emphasis on working software actually defining what the standard is and almost eliciting the standards from the working software itself. The second development I wanted to highlight is that there are issues, and this is again in particular with IETF, there are issues that arise that are outside of the expertise of the group developing this fact. I don't know if you remember from last year, there was this whole row about battery status, which is part of the HTML API, which is a very neat way for your browser to actually keep track of how much battery is left on your device, so it can help accommodate that in the way in which it interacts with you. But the combination of the percentage of battery available and the number of seconds battery life remaining was so unique that it could lead as a proxy for fingerprinting your device and could be sort of misused in that way. Now, this has never come up when the standard was being developed. People never sort of raised that. One of the things that were mentioned here in the workshop where the person who investigated this specific issue was presenting was quite interesting. He advocated for getting broader participation from civil society into these types of processes, because it is mostly the commercial players in there with more of a narrow view in terms of what they're trying to achieve within these processes. So experts on privacy and security are needed in all of these processes actually these days for all of these standards to ensure that those types of concerns are being addressed sufficiently during the process. And that was an issue where no one in the room actually had a really good thorough solution for that. There are initiatives for these types of issues that work across the board and across various sort of standard processes. So, for example, around accessibility, there's a separate initiative on web accessibility, which has been relatively successful. But yeah, the issue of ensuring that those types of things are being addressed within the process itself is still relatively open and unresolved, unfortunately. That was what I wanted to share now. I don't know if it's useful, if there are any questions at this point now, or Paul, I know you and I haven't really caught up on this specific topic right now, but if it's useful maybe to share a bit more about your ideas, what this might mean for our work at Open Knowledge International and our engagement with these standards. Paul, do you want to comment? Or if not, are there any questions?
Sandra, I just came back and forth on the call. I heard you ask me if I wanted to cover it, but I'm not sure I got the whole context.
So I was asking about the involvement potentially for OKI in these standards approaches for IETF.
Ah, yeah. I've only been learning about them. I mean, I guess I'm a kind of annoyed observer from the side of these type of standards. For starters, I've been trying to work on submitting the frictionless data specifications as IETF standards, and that's a process that I haven't finished yet, but it's quite interesting. I guess you'd call them like technical barriers to even submitting a standard there, down to formatting of the way that a standard needs to be formatted, the text formatting for it to even be submitted. But in terms of the social processes, I just don't know enough about it. And I think that it'd be good if we took more part in some W3C standards processes. But again, I'm a little bit, it feels very bureaucratic to the way that we work. I mean, I know there have been prior examples, like say Rufus being involved in CSV on the web, which didn't work out too well. But I'm not really sure how we should approach sort of consolidating or being more aligned with our work with these more formal standards bodies. I'm not really sure that I have a good opinion on how we should go about that in the future.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, I think it's a tricky one. On the one hand, I think there's a good opportunity to raise awareness, as I said in the beginning of my presentation. On the other hand, they are can be fairly long processes and require sort of deep engagement for a longer period of time. So it's like it's a substantial investment of time and effort that it would need to make in order to make this the standard. And there's always this question of almost like relinquishing control over your standard. If you submit it to a standards body, whether it's W3C or IETF, there's always the question of other people co-owning what you've developed. So basically, by submitting it to such a body, you're saying, you're giving up your baby more or less, and other people can make some drastic changes which the rest of the community may agree with, but are not necessarily in line with what you personally or what we as OKI would like to achieve. Yeah, but thanks for that. Are there any other questions from anyone? Brooke?
Just picking up on that point where you lose control over things with standards. I had some friends who were deeply involved in the WOFF standard for web fonts online, and the issue there was, so they run type foundries. They're really involved in technology and typefaces, and they saw that browser manufacturers were essentially creating the standards themselves and the formats that they were supporting, and that they weren't necessarily aligned with the interests of those that create type and create fonts. So they quite quickly and devoted a lot of time into the preparing of the first WOFF standard, the open standard for fonts online. And that was to do with taking control over that aspect, because they had the deepest financial interest. Though they represented foundries which had the deepest financial interest, but they had very little clout as far as the size of their organizations were. They're tiny organizations compared to Microsoft and Apple and whoever else. So it does go both ways.
Yeah, that's an interesting example. I've not heard of that, Brooke. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, it's a good way. So when someone's doing things the wrong way, you can try and force them into this kind of sort of open conversation to let the balance maybe work out in your favor more or less. Yeah, it's really interesting.
Yeah. because yeah, browser manufacturers were proposing a sort of DRM type of solution for fonts online, and that would have put a lot of legal burden on font foundries. So that's one thing around standards is who does it impact, and who has to take the burden of the implementation. And if you're not involved in that design, but it's something which you're going to have a great interest in, then you may end up taking a burden which you're unable to financially support because you're actually a small organization as opposed to Microsoft.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Brooke. Any other questions or points for discussion? I'll hand back to Adam.
Okay, yeah, so thanks. It was really interesting. And we're pretty much on time, so if no one has any other questions, then I think we're pretty much done. So thanks, and see you in 2 weeks.
Thanks, Sander.
Thanks, Adam.